Hi everyone, thank you for joining today. My name is Amy G and I'm the Outreach Programme Manager at the Holocaust Educational Trust. Our mission is to educate every person from every background about the history of the Holocaust. One of the ways that we do this is to ensure that every person has access to survivor testimony. We work with over 70 Holocaust survivors, all of whom speak in schools across the UK, reaching 100,000 people a year. I'm joined today by one of our incredible speakers, Tomi Komoly. Tomi is a Hungarian Holocaust survivor who lived in Budapest during the Second World War, and he's going to share with us his recollections from that time. Hi, Tomi. Ready?
Yes, I'm ready, thank you.
Okay, so I'll start with the first question. You were born in Budapest in 1936. You were very young during the Second World War, but can you tell me something about your life in the lead up to when things started to become difficult for your family?
Well, just to put it in a very few words, I was an only child in a fairly typical Budapest Jewish family. We lived in one of the suburbs. My father ran a tiny business, a scrap metal yard, and he came from a Zionist family. His father was one of the founding members of the first Zionist Congress, and that was a tradition going right through the family amongst the three brothers and three sisters. And I started going to a Jewish school, which only lasted a fairly short time because as things began to develop, Jewish schools were closed down. And that really was the run-up for me to the events of the 40s as they developed later.
So you lived with your parents. What were their jobs? What did your parents do every day?
Attended to his business. My mother basically looked after the house and myself as a typical housewife would in those days, and nothing out of the usual really that I can mention to you.
Yeah. And what was this city like at that time? Like, where did you live? Did you live with other Jewish people, or did you live, out in other communities?
Well, in Hungary, there was a somewhat peculiar situation in terms of Jewish communities. Religious communities, by and large, lived in rural areas. Most people are familiar with the name Satmar. That was a Hungarian rural region where the famous Satmar Rebbe came from. And they were the ultra-Orthodox community. Budapest had a huge, somewhat secular community, which belonged to what they call themselves the Neolog branch of Judaism, which is more or less equivalent to the American conservative nowadays. And so in Budapest, we did not very much live in communities, although there were some concentrations in certain areas. But we lived in a suburb because of my father's business. So we were not in the mainstream as it were.
Okay, thank you. In 1938, the Hungarian government introduced a series of anti-Jewish measures. Can you tell us about the consequences of those measures generally within the city for Jewish people and specifically for your family?
To get a fraction more understanding of these measures, what happened in Hungary in the 20th century as industrialization and the like spread and education spread, the Hungarian Jewish community achieved an amazing preponderance in all kinds of areas of life. in academia, in business, in science, in engineering, in journalism, in the arts, you name it. There were a huge number of Jewish people, eminent Jewish people, Nobel Prize winners and all the rest of it, even in sports, Olympic champions. And uh, when I say preponderance, I mean in some of these areas, they were sometimes up to 50% of the Hungarian population, although in the Jews in Hungary only represented about 6%. And this generated a lot of, let's call it ill feeling or jealousy, more like it. So the government brought in regulations which came under the heading of numerous clauses, meaning that they wanted to restrict Jewish participation in higher education compared to the 6% presence in the population. They wanted to keep it down to 2%. And in fact, as the years went on, 39 ish, they made it a 0%, they called it numerus nullus. What the result of this was, I didn't mention commerce and trade as being also constrained, and the civil service. Something like 200,000 Jews lost their livelihood. And in personal terms, what it meant, my father had to hand over his business to his foreman and lost his livelihood. He, in fact, had to teach himself to do some very small scale ceramics and sell his products to people to make a living of some sort. And I had an uncle who wanted to study architecture. He couldn't do it in Hungary. He had to go to Vienna. But when he qualified and he came home, he wanted to get a job. There was no possibility for him. And he was very upset. He had to go abroad, in fact, to start making a living. He didn't realize at the time that this was a blessing in disguise, because he, through this, he managed to escape what was to follow later on. So that's how things developed.
And following on from that, can you tell us a little bit about your dad specifically? Because I know there's quite a bit of a story to tell about him. Can you tell us what happened to him in the next few years after those measures came in?
Well, Hungary entered the war on the side of the Germans, primarily to regain lost territories, which got detached from Hungary after the First World War, and they were also on the German side. So, having joined the war, Germany eventually required them to send troops to the Eastern Front against the Soviet troops. And fairly soon after that, the Hungarian government felt that Jews should be participating in the war effort, but they didn't dare to give them arms. And so they created units, translated into English, you would call them forced labor units. And all Jewish men between the ages of 18 and 60 got called up. And my father in 1943 was one of these people. And he went off. I didn't see him for months and months and months. And he must have had a commanding officer, non-Jewish commanding officer, who probably felt a degree of sympathy towards him and gave him a 3-day leave to come back and see my mother and myself. He turned up, and we were all very happy, except in those days we were already in, I can explain about that, but in a kind of close community by necessity. And we were supervised where we were staying by a janitor who had a kind of allegiance to the Hungarian fascist organization that was extremely powerful in those days, and increasingly so. They were called the Arrow Cross. And he reported my father being with us because he was worried that his presence was surplus to requirements, so to speak. And the couple of Arrow Cross guys came along with guns, took him away, and this was, I know very well, the 5th of November 1944, because I was hoping that for the 10th of November he would be home for my birthday. But that was the last time I saw him.
Yeah.
We don't know. Just he disappeared.
And at this point, so I think we're going to go slightly back now, but you'll make it all make sense, I'm sure. I just wanted to ask you what happened after the Germans invaded Hungary in 1944. How were you and your family affected? And you've talked about how your dad was affected, but I wonder if you can tell me a little bit about what you and your mum were doing at this time, and whether you had to leave home, or how did you find food, all of those kinds of things. So specifically to do with you and your mum.
Well, it was a rather hectic period. In 1944, in the spring, the Hungarian government could see themselves ending up on the losing side of the war, and put out feelers to the British for a separate peace treaty. Hitler found out about it, and on the 19th of March, which I remember very well, sent German troops. They were, I could see them marching down in columns of tanks and infantry down the main streets. And very soon after that, the government changed to a more extreme government, and they brought in much more drastic anti-Jewish measures. And in fact, it's quite sad. This year, Pesach was just now. In Hungary in 44, Pesach was on the 7th of April, almost exactly like this year. And that was almost exactly the day when they started talking about setting up ghettos in the provinces. And within 2 weeks, a week after Pesach, the first deportation started. The trains taking first the ruled Jewry to primarily to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And the speed of the deportations was absolutely out of people's imagination. In 2.5 months, they deported something like 600,000, and virtually only the Budapest population of Jews remained intact at that point in time. And by June, the government brought in regulations that Jews were not allowed to stay in their homes. They nominated in Budapest 2,000 apartment buildings, which they called the Yellow Star buildings. This was on top of having made us compulsorily wear yellow stars on our outer garments. But this was now the houses, where we were given something like 5 square meters per person as an allowance. So my mother and I found out that an aunt had a small one-bedroom flat, which is about 20 square meters, and she had another relation living there, and the two of us moved in. So the 4 of us made up a unit, and this was a hardship on top of all the other hardships, like we had a curfew. We could only go out 3 or 4 hours a day. We had no doctors, if we had no doctors or dentists in a particular building, we really, in practical terms, we couldn't go to a hospital to get treatment, so we were really without much medical attention. We also had rationing, which had a another effect on us. My mother, having been left without my father's support, she started making a living by doing baking and delivering um, cakes and biscuits and what have you. But because of the rationing, in order to carry on with the baking, she had to take quantities away from what we had for ourselves.
Yeah.
So you can imagine that as I then was a 8-year-old child, I wasn't too happy with
No, I can't imagine
that.
you were.
That really,
That must have been quite
with
hard for her, having to sort of keep you safe and try and keep things normal as well.
well, it was a difficult existence because on top of everything else, um, um, I think I lost my picture for a second. On top of everything else, um, the government regulations also constrained us in communications. We had to hand in radios. They took away um, telephones from everybody. So really, the only contact we had was either within the house where we lived, or
Mm.
if we managed to go maybe visit a relation in the 3 hours available. That
Yeah.
was our only link to the outside world,
Mm.
and it was pretty hard. I think
Um,
sometimes I'm being asked. Sorry, you go on. Ask your question.
sorry to interrupt you. I think there's a bit of a delay, Tomi. I just want to ask you a bit more about the Yellow Star houses. So you were in a Yellow Star house with your mum. Can you tell us a little bit what they were like? Can you tell us what the conditions were like?
That tended to happen. Then, of course, it's a little bit like the present moment with coronavirus. Um, you had nothing to do, and I don't know if I was unique in that or not. But I found in the whole house where we were staying, I don't know, must be 100, 200 people. Uh, I didn't have a playmate. And I often reflect that, strange as it may sound, one of the things I was really missing is a kind of growing up as a normal child in that sense, playing in the yard or playing on the street or whatever. There was just no possibility for that.
Mm.
And added to it, by this time we're talking winter of 44, after the Normandy landing and after the Red Army started advancing, both the American and the British Air Force started bombing raids over Budapest. And the Americans would come during the day, the British overnight. And this house had a huge cellar. And whenever the sirens went to report an air raid, we'd have to troop down. Sometimes in the middle of the night, you had to jump out of bed and spend hours and hours and hours in the basement. And one peculiar memory I have is, notwithstanding the what I mentioned to you about having to hand in radios, somebody has obviously hidden one, and they were listening in the basement to either Voice of America or the BBC, the Hungarian language
Mm.
broadcast. And I would just creep up behind this group of people, and I could hear the news. That was my kind of introduction to political and historical awareness in those days. And it's a very strange feeling when you know that the people from the broadcast, I realized that the people dropping the bombs were our friends,
Mm.
because if they win the war, we would be safe again. But if one of those bombs happened to fall where you were, that was the end of you, and then end of everything else. And even as a child, you try to sort out just exactly where you stood in the middle of all this.
So you stayed in the Yellow Star house with your mum for a while, and then she thought it would be safer if you left and went somewhere else. So you escaped and went into hiding at the end of 1944. Can you tell us about where your mum took you, and where you stayed?
Well, the situation in Budapest literally week by week got worse and worse. The news came through that in addition to having set up the Yellow Star houses I mentioned, they also started creating a ghetto in the heart of the city, which is only about a square mile. And my mother was extremely aware of everything that was going on around us. And she just wasn't prepared if there is a possibility to escape, that she wasn't prepared to follow the instructions. And there were two or three neutral embassies in Hungary at the time who were sympathetic to the Jewish situation. And what they started doing, they acquired some property additional to their embassies and consulates. And they put up their flags and emblems and called them diplomatic territory, which, strange as it may sound, the Germans and even the Hungarians respected as sacred and no entry for their forces. And Sweden, a lot of people have heard about Raoul Wallenberg, who was their kind of lead person in this, and also a Swiss person called Karl Lutz, who did similar things. So uh, my mother found out through some route that we could have accommodation in one of the Swedish houses. I still know the street where it was located, Columbus Street. And we moved in there, and we had something like 35 or 40 people. And it's not a pleasant way of being when you in a 4-bedroom villa to have that many people with the facilities aimed basically at one family. You can imagine it could lead to a lot of friction and problems, even when you're all kind of sharing the same fate. But we were kind of putting up with it because there was no alternative there. And but we had a one other event which really stayed with me ever since. And I didn't know at the time. My mother told me only in the late 60s. That's when I first heard. She went out delivering food, the cakes she was delivering. She was caught and rounded up by the Arrow Cross, together with a couple of hundred people. They were leading her to one of the trains to be deported. And she realized that not only would that be the end of her, but because I was left with a bunch of strangers, nobody would look after me. And she decided to make a run for it. And these guys, four gunned Arrow Cross guys, tried to shoot her, and they kept missing. And uh, she looked back, and to her amazement, she found that not one person followed her example. Everybody by this time is so totally, I can only describe now as a grown-up, psychologically damaged and hopeless. They just said follow orders, and do as you're told. And it still stays with me when I see any sign of trouble or danger hovering on the horizon. Lifetime learning.
I think we've just got time for maybe one more question, Tomi, before we finish. You and your mum both survived the war. That's right, isn't it?
Correct, yes.
And you stayed in Budapest after the war, and tried to sort of rebuild a life there, but you then decided to leave and come to England. Can you tell us very briefly why you decided to come to England? And then maybe we could end, if you've got anything that you want to say to the audience, any messages that you want to share with everybody, then maybe that would be a good place to end today.
Well, Hungary became a strange place to live in after liberation, because between the Soviets and the British and American, the agreement was that East European countries would be occupied and run under the communist regime. And I grew up in that system, which in theory was a very very nice and egalitarian and democratic system. In practice, it didn't really work out like that. We all had to make compromises and accept the situation as it developed, not very favorably. Then in 1956, the students started protesting against how the system was being run. And that got put down by the police and the army with weapons. And for a short time, the Hungarian borders, which previously had been controlled by minefields and all the rest of it, we had never had the opportunity to leave the country previously, but the borders became open, and I became one of a couple of 100,000 Hungarian refugees in Austria. And I was given the opportunity to get a scholarship and come to Britain, and that's where I carried on with my university studies, set up a life, set up a family, and I'm still happily living here. And when you ask me to say something about the present situation, I can't help but mention that I'm a bit concerned about the populist developments in Europe and the US, which are not that far removed from the things that were happening in the 30s in Europe. And I can see the danger of everything spilling over and getting out of control. And although in Britain in particular, I can personally say I've never had any trouble being Jewish. I didn't have to face anti-Semitism or anything of the like. Even with last year's political happenings, I always felt confident that the situation will work itself out here. But I think people must take a stand, and I think Yom HaShoah is a fantastic opportunity to stay at the Jewish togetherness and to reinforce people's thinkings and feelings, to organize and join forces and remember what happened. That would be my message, if a message is required.
Thank you, Tomi. Thanks so much. I think that's a really great place to end the session. So thank you so much, Tomi, for sharing your testimony with us. It's been incredible to hear all of that detail from you. And thanks to everybody that's watching at home. Thanks for joining us. Thank you to Yom HaShoah UK. We're really proud at HET to have been part of today's programme. It's a fantastic programme. So Tomi, I'll say goodbye to you for now, and bye everybody. Thank you for watching.